these two taking the blame for everyone that's dead? It's not their fault that everyone's dead.
They're just lucky that Darrell Knight found the phone to phone a cab.
Darrell Knight? Please. What about his arrest record? What about the trouble that man's been in?
Does that mean he should die?
No, that doesn't mean he should die. Nobody should die. No one at all should have to die.
Your
and
kind
pay
of
the price.
racism is what I've been fighting.
No, I'm not racist because my friends are Indian as well.
Anyone
my
that says
friends
I'm
are
not
Native.
racist friends are Indian. Racist.
But sure,
Some
I
of
may
my
have.
best friends are Indian.
Some of my friends are, and yeah, I have a certain amount of racism because I've dealt with enough of Native that have caused me nothing but hell and havoc. Broke into my homes.
Why
okay?
People have done that to me.
Well,
my nose is broken. I have
how many beers do you drink and how much
big
bingo do you do?
Body.
And how much welfare are you guys on?
Hi my friend, I'm Royson and welcome back to Tea and Crime. Did that clip get your blood boiling? It certainly affected me. I mean, that angry woman was actively defending two policemen who, actively or deliberately put a man's life at risk. Now this happened in the Saskatchewan area of Canada, specifically in the City of Saskatoon, where the police engaged in an illegal practice known as Starlight Tours. You've probably heard of them before. I mean, what they would do is arrest someone from the indigenous community for whatever reason, then drive them to the outskirts of the city at night to abandon them in sub-zero conditions. The first recorded case goes back to at least 1976. Something sinister happened in the year 2000 that would eventually open up an old case from 1990 concerning a 17-year-old named Neil Stonechild, who froze to death under mysterious circumstances, leaving his mother and family in absolute turmoil. Before we talk about that, we need to find out what happened in 2000, as it demonstrates the brutality of the Saskatoon police. Now, whether it's your first time here or you've been here before, I'd like to invite you to stick around as we deep dive into this very disturbing police practice. Saskatoon is a city of bridges and appropriately named due to the 8 structures that span the South Saskatchewan River. The bridges are a part of the fabric of the community and of its history. However, over several decades, this region of Canada was plagued by a different kind of history, where a number of indigenous men, associated with mysterious deaths, were being found in fields in the middle of nowhere at the height of the winter season. They were discovered wearing inadequate clothing that clearly didn't provide protection against the elements. These dreadful occurrences became known as Starlight Tours, which occasionally led to the untimely deaths of Aboriginal people. The deaths were allegedly caused by members of the Saskatoon Police Service. Police are typically responsible for maintaining public order and safety, enforcing law in preventing, detecting and investigating criminal activities. These functions are known as policing. Yet if the police caused these deaths, it suggests that as opposed to investigating the crimes, they were actually committing them, which is a complete reversal of their role. In January 2000, 2 Caucasian policemen picked up an indigenous chap named Darrell Knight outside his uncle's apartment where an argument occurred. Knight, who'd been drinking, was shouting obscenities, but when he was picked up he had this idea the police were going to take him to their local station, perhaps keeping him in overnight, recording the incident. However, he was wrong. Instead, they handcuffed him, placed him in their vehicle, and immediately drove the man straight out of town, eventually arriving at an isolated spot about 3 miles outside of Saskatoon. And that's where they kicked him out of the car and aggressively took the handcuffs off him, abandoning Mr. Knight in that area. Before they drove away, Darrell said to them,
I told them, I'll freeze to death out here, you guys. And they stopped. You can hear the tires crunching on the snow. And I can hear the electric window go down. And I remember that driver there said, that's your effing problem. And they drove away.
Darrell was only wearing a t-shirt, a pair of jeans, a light jacket, plus a pair of trainers to cover his feet. He was absolutely unprepared for the ferocious weather conditions, where temperatures can drop to 40 degrees below zero. Unsurprisingly, Darrell had heard about Starlight Tours before.
All those rumors I heard in the past, they were all coming true.
This poor man believed he'd soon be found dead. He was terrified about the prospects of being found in a field, deceased as one more dead Indian, with no witnesses. Therefore he battled through snow until he reached the Queen Elizabeth Power Station, where he made as much noise as possible to catch the attention of one of its security guards. The guard let him in, unaware he'd just potentially saved Darrell's life. Several frozen bodies of Aboriginal men had been found in exactly the same area Darrell was dumped. Alarmingly, rumours had circulated throughout Saskatoon that these men were dumped there by the authorities, who were fully aware of the undesirable, life-threatening circumstances. But the problem was this: there was no tangible evidence to prove these suspicions as being true, until now, when Darrell actually survived his ordeal. Now, fortunately for Mr. Knight, he was able to identify the police officers who did this to him. The officers were disrespectful, calling him a drunken Indian, alongside other racially motivated comments. Darrell was left traumatized by the horrible situation, causing him to reconsider his confidence in the authorities. However, his case managed to put the Saskatoon Police Service under heavy fire due to these allegations, resulting in an explosion of emotions within the community. This lady was really animated and angry about the fact that police were being disciplined. She clearly had racist inclinations as identified by the way she attacked Darrell, who was actually the victim of the police. She referred to his arrest record, which had nothing to do with the way the police treated him. She expressed no concern regarding Darrell's experience, even though police had deliberately endangered his life. And this demonstrates what was happening in Saskatchewan around that period. The officers Darrell identified were Dan Hatchin and Ken Monson, who eventually admitted they did pick Darrell up, dropping him off in the bitter cold, and it was miles away from his home. As a result, both officers were suspended from duty on full pay, eventually being fired. An investigation into 2 deaths that occurred in January and February of 2000, plus the Darrell Knight case, was conducted by the RCMP, the federal police force in Canada, indicating how serious things were developing due to the substantial amount of pressure being placed on the authorities because of what happened to Darrell. And I was disgusted with the attitude of the 2 policemen who dumped Darrell because, during the trial, they tried to convince everyone that Darrell asked them to drop him off in that danger zone. Why would he ask to be dropped off in sub-zero temperatures while severely underdressed? And even if it was proven that he did ask, which he didn't, who in their right mind would have left him there? Well, we know the 2 officers did, as they were willing to endanger his life. And as a consequence, they were found guilty of unlawful confinement, which means depriving someone of their liberty while seizing them against their will. What does that sound like to you? To me, my friend, it sounds like kidnapping. And they were sentenced to 8 months imprisonment, although they only served around 4 of them. The scariest thing about this is, if Darrell didn't survive after what they did to him, they'd never have been identified. And if that happened, what would it have meant? Well, let me know what you think down in the comments. Many people, as you can imagine, were outraged when they heard what had happened. And it wasn't long after this that many others from the Aboriginal community from across Canada, not just from Saskatchewan, started to report their own stories of police brutality and abuse. In the Saskatchewan area of Canada, prison populations for both men and women seem overpopulated with indigenous people, according to government statistics. It's not that they commit more crime than others, but rather they end up in jail for their actions much more frequently than others, which is a cause for concern in its own right. Somewhere along the line, some of the police officers in Saskatoon, not all of them, preferred to deal with incidents of bad behaviour or drunkenness from this community by driving them to the outskirts of the city at night in the freezing cold, leaving them there, instead of booking or taking them to the station. This unauthorised method was a deviation from what the criminal code required, and as such it was a deliberate action with sinister intentions, as it placed people in danger of dying due to hypothermia, and they knew that. In fact, on the 29th of January, the night after Darrell was abandoned by police, the body of 25-year-old Rodney Nastus, another Aboriginal man, was found shirtless in the same location, on the edge of Saskatoon, in an industrial area just north of the power plant. He was found by a politician named Pat Laurier, who was out jogging. She described his body as being frozen blue. He was wearing thin clothing with his bare chest exposed, and she noticed tears in his eyes. Then on the 3rd of February, just a few days later, another young indigenous man, 30-year-old Lawrence Wegner, was found near the same place. He went missing a few days previously, when the temperatures in Saskatoon fell below -22 degrees. By the time he was discovered, he was frozen solid. Lawrence was also inappropriately dressed and wasn't wearing shoes. Ominously, his coat or shoes were never found. How did they disappear? However, inquests in 2001 and in 2002 regarding the deaths of these two men were unable to determine exactly what transpired in their respective cases. The conclusion was they died due to hypothermia, with no evidence of police involvement. Yet suspicions around these events, even to this very day, have left people with serious questions. Questions like, why would these two men walk miles away from their homes in severe weather conditions, heading for isolated fields during the night? And were they the victims of Starlight Tours? I mean, it's possible they were, but any evidence left behind had either been tampered with or destroyed. And it was reported that a witness saw Lawrence Wegner in the back of a police car just before he was found dead. Yet that evidence had been interfered with. The witness spent a considerable amount of her time providing a description of the officer she saw to an RCMP sketch artist. And once she was happy with the finished product, it was signed off with her approval. However, when it was released to the media, it was missing vital elements like bags under the officer's eyes, while the shape of his face had been altered. All the work she'd put into this to help with the investigation was literally taken away. These appalling events where Mr. Knight was abandoned, being left trying to survive dangerous temperatures, plus the two frozen bodies found within days of that, would push up to the surface another similar mysterious death that happened a decade earlier, and it left behind a ton of suspicion regarding the way it was handled, while creating heartache for his mother, who desperately wanted answers. On that occasion, the victim was 17-year-old Neil Stonechild, whose body was discovered in the northwest section of Saskatoon on the 29th of November 1990. His demise left some strange marks on his wrists and face. Unfortunately, the authorities didn't take his death seriously, and if the events we've just talked about never happened, his case would probably have remained buried. Once the RCMP started investigating the suspicious deaths of Rodney Nastus and Lawrence Wegner, the two men who were found in almost identical circumstances to Neil's, as well as the dreadful treatment handed to Darrell Knight, it was an appropriate move on their part to add Neil's case to their list, especially as it wasn't given any justice originally. When Neil's body was found, he was only wearing jeans, a light jacket, and one of his shoes was missing. Yet the weather was bitterly cold, at -28 degrees Celsius. Suspiciously, within a week, the Saskatoon police closed the investigation into his dismal death, despite the visible injuries to his wrists and face. The police didn't attempt to explain why he was missing a shoe, or how he had walked 9 kilometers in a snowstorm, or what possibly caused the cuts to his nose, and worryingly they closed the files on him before receiving the coroner's and toxicology reports. In addition to that, they hadn't completed interviews with witnesses who had valuable input to share leading up to the death. And you'll never believe what the investigating officer said when quickly closing the case. His words were, the kid went out, got drunk, went for a walk, and froze to death. In other words, he was seen as a young drunkard who was responsible for what happened, and as a consequence, the case was concluded with no explanation or any charges, as no officers from the police department admitted having him in their custody. But we're going to get to the truth about that in a moment. However, the death of Neil Stonechild would eventually become the subject of a public inquiry. Whenever people think about that dreadful police practice known as Starlight Tours, his name lights up like a Christmas tree. Fortunately, one of the Saskatoon police officers was troubled by the handling of Stonechild's death, taking his concerns to his superiors. But it didn't go well for him. In fact, his concerns were met with anger, and he was told to stay away from the case. He was even threatened that something could happen to him if he pursued it. Despite that, he managed to make a copy of the original file, which eventually came in handy because the Saskatoon police went on to destroy all files associated with this case, and you can imagine the issues that would have created for the public inquiry that kicked off in 2003. Fortunately, the officer who copied the file kept it for years, and as soon as a public inquiry was ordered, he handed that essential piece of information to the RCMP. The file reported in detail just how flimsy and inadequate the investigation had been. Yet Neil's mum was told that her son's death had been thoroughly investigated, which was a complete lie. Over the course of the 14-month inquiry, a close friend of Neil's, a young man named Jason Roy, testified that he saw Neil in the back of a police car on the night that he went missing. Neil was allegedly screaming to his friend for help, saying the police were going to kill him. He was scared beyond belief, with blood running down his face. Jason Roy told family and friends about this at the time and even reported it to the police, but authorities made sure it wasn't included in their original report. During the inquiry, he was able to share what he witnessed that night.
Jason Roy was Neil's friend.
A police car pulled in front of me, and Neil was in the back. From the moment he saw me, he was very irate. He was freaking out. He was saying, "Jay, help me. These guys, just help me. These guys are gonna kill me."
Did you observe his condition?
He had fresh blood on his face, across his nose. I couldn't see all that well, but he had his face to the window, and he was yelling at me, asking me to help him.
Because Neil was found with marks on his wrists and face, the inquiry into his death chose to debate whether he'd been handcuffed while in police custody, and these details implied it was hard to ignore police involvement. The Honourable David Wright, the commissioner of the inquiry, believed the testimony of Jason Roy, Neil's friend, that he saw Neil bloodied and bruised in the back of a police car prior to his death. Justice Wright concluded that the officers who had Stonechild in custody were Constables Larry Hartwig and Brad Senger, and this was around midnight on the 24th of November when Jason Roy last saw his friend alive. But both officers denied having Neil in their car. Yet, police records confirmed they were lying. Hartwig and Senger received a call from dispatch on the night of the 24th of November. They were informed that a 17-year-old named Neil Stonechild was causing a disturbance while under the influence of alcohol. They then set off in search for him at 11:51 p.m. However, the officers maintained they couldn't remember whether Stonechild was in their vehicle on the night of the 24th and claimed they didn't recognise his name when his body was found. It's of interest to know that Hartwig had arrested Neil on several occasions prior to this, yet couldn't remember his name, even though he punched it into a police computer in his vehicle. He also stopped Neil's friend Jason Roy, who actually saw Neil in the police car, and it petrified him when he saw the state of his friend's face. These police records prove that Jason Roy was telling the truth. The inquiry, however, suggested that Neil Stonechild died of exposure during the early hours of the 25th of November, a few days before his frozen body was discovered. Even though the Commissioner admitted the 1990 investigation was superficial and thoroughly inadequate, with senior officers ignoring the fact that Stonechild's death was suspicious, he didn't associate these actions as an actual murder, or even as racism. But they did indicate a tense relationship between the police and the Aboriginal community. Could it have been that the two officers involved in Neil's case were angry and frustrated with him? Admittedly, the 17-year-old had been drinking the night he was apprehended and was well known to police. Could they have decided to take him on a Starlight Tour to teach him a lesson? Now, if that was the case, I'd like to know why they'd risk someone's life in the interest of discipline. And why did the officers continually deny having Neil in their custody? By the end of the 14-month inquiry, the two officers Larry Hartwig and Brad Sanger were fired, and the Chief of Police apologised to Neil's mother for all the pain she'd endured in trying to get to the bottom of her son's death. And even though it wasn't 100% satisfactory, at least it was a start. Hypocritically, Officer Larry Hartwig once explained what it meant to be a police officer. Take a listen.
I've worked on 3 different reserves, and I've developed a healthy respect for the Aboriginal community.
Hello, is that in?
We always have to be very, very careful as police officers because we have a tremendous amount of authority. And with that comes a tremendous amount of responsibility. We must never, ever, ever abuse our authority as police officers. We have the authority to literally destroy lives. We literally do have that authority. And we must always be careful that that authority is never, ever abused.
Unfortunately for him, even though he sounded rather convincing as if he was Spider-Man with that great responsibility, he did the exact opposite to that when dealing with Neil Stonechild. However, no one has ever been charged directly with causing the death of any of these indigenous men. The truth about their deaths has never been revealed, which is excruciatingly painful, especially for their families. And let's just take a moment to pay our respect to those that we've spoken about in this video. And I'm quite convinced that we'll all agree with this, that human life is to be valued and honoured, as no one deserves to be treated with disrespect, especially due to the colour of their skin or their personal life choices, whether it conflicts with our own or not. The sad thing about this is these cases were only investigated because Darrell Knight survived his Starlight Tour. Now, if he hadn't survived, what do you think the outcome would have been? Let me know in the comments. Well, I'm Royston, and I'll see you next Sunday. Thanks for watching.